If we were having this conversation in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon, we would have thought that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire would last forever. The Babylonian, the Assyrian, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, civilizations in the end crash and burn. And mostly through suicide, not through murder. They collapse internally. Putin has made it quite clear that he believes the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is the breakup of the Soviet Union. Not World War II, not the losses incurred in World War II. It's the breakup of the Soviet Union. Anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. It is easily awoken. And it is extraordinary that how the response around the world has been so anti-Semitic over what's going on in Israel. I mean, people parading on the streets supporting Hamas, frankly, Hamas would throw them off the top of the building in terms of their sexuality, or in terms of their political views or whatever. China and Russia and others think that the West is crumbling.
They may well be right. That's what chills me.
They may well be right. The West has suffered from a lack of morally courageous leadership. We've moved from an us and we society to a me and I society. We need to convince our leadership that this is a battle that is happening, it's real, and it's one that we can win through on.
Major General Tim Cross, CBE, was commissioned into the British Army in 1971. He's commanded at every level, including commanding one of the 3 divisions of the United Kingdom Field Army. He served in many countries and helped plan the Iraq invasion of 2003. Retiring in February of 2007, he was the Army advisor to the United Kingdom House of Commons Defence Committee for 7 years until 2014. And now runs a broad portfolio in the business, charity and academic worlds. Well, General Cross, it's a great privilege to be able to talk to you. We met face-to-face quite recently in London. This is not face-to-face. I'm out in rural New South Wales and you're not far from London, Aldershot as I understand it. But thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. It's great to talk to you, John. Nice to see you again.
Now, I'm intrigued. I understand that from a very early age you were quite keen on the army. You even tried to get in as young as the age of 14. I thought only merchant mariners could join the services as young as that. What was it that drove you?
Yeah, I think, first of all, my favourite quote, which I often use when I'm lecturing, is by H.G. Wells, who is reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability, he said, would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. Now, I didn't know that when I was 14, but what I did know was I was no academic. I enjoyed school, but I played a lot of sport, a lot of adventure training. I joined the Scouts and all those sort of traditional things, really. And it was quite clear to me that I would not want to be working in any other environment really other than the military. And if I'm honest, I find it difficult to believe why any young man between the ages of about 14 to 25 wants to do anything other than be in the military, because it's a great life and it's it's something I knew I wanted to do it. So I joined the cadets when I was 14. That was in 1964, so barely 20 years after D-Day. And of course, the world was a different place then, and everybody in the UK and indeed many other countries around the world obviously had fought through World War II and many of them World War I. So everybody knew about the military. It was a large organization, and it had all sorts of attractions in terms of serving all over the world and so on. So it's all I ever really wanted to do. Now, that said, I didn't come from a military family. My father worked for Shell, and was an oil man, an engineer, a chemical engineer. But yeah, that's what I wanted to do, and I tried to join an infantry regiment. When I was 14, I was told to go away by a rather rough-looking sergeant and come back when I was 16, which I did. And I then went to an army college and subsequently to Sandhurst and was commissioned when I was 20 in 1971.
Well, come back to this issue of soldiering or serving in the services as a vocation as we talk. But before we do, you were in the British Army, which has always in the past been highly regarded, of course, although I just make the comment that as an outsider, it seems to me that Britain, as an island nation with a far-flung empire, is probably traditionally thought of more as a naval power.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And my eldest son was a nuclear submariner, joined the Navy. Frankly, I think that's what we need to be still in terms of the balance between the land component, the maritime component, and indeed the air component. And in today's world, of course, there are these other domains of space and cyber and so on. But we've just announced a new strategic defense review, not a strategic defense and security review, which were the last two or three were security. This one is very firmly focused on pure defense capabilities. And I think part of that will be, what do we want to look like in the context of the balance between maritime, land, air, and these other domains? And for many, I think, NATO, what they look to us to do is to be a power that maintains the freedom of seas around the Atlantic, the UK, and indeed, potentially elsewhere. So when we come back to maybe discussing what should the size and shape of the land component be, I think we have to put that in the context of that broader maritime strategy, which, to be honest, although I was in the army for 43 years, man and boy, I think is right. I think the balance should be in the maritime world.
Well, notwithstanding your very modest remarks about your intellectual capabilities, which I don't believe for a moment, by the way, the reality is that you are a very senior person in defence circles. Your views are frequently sought, and it is also the case that one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that you and other very, very senior British servicemen, defence chiefs and what have you, have been making some pretty tough remarks about how dangerous the world is and how we need to snap out of it and wake up. And as much as anything else, I'd love a helicopter view from you as to how you think the world is dangerous and how dangerous it actually is.
Yeah, it's clearly a crucial debate in the context of all sorts of other aspects of politics, economics, and so on. I mean, I think it's definitely a more unpredictable world. I mean, when I joined in '64, of course, it was the beginnings, or just starting really, the Cold War years, a bipolar world, a very clear, in one sense, clear world of the balance between the US, Warsaw Pact, and NATO, NATO and US, and the Warsaw Pact. Most of the conflicts around the world, bore that Cold War in mind, and we had very large forces lined up against each other, and the development of the nuclear race, and all the things that flowed from that. But in many ways, that was quite a predictable world, with a fair amount of certainty to it. Now, I don't want to overplay that, because clearly, with the potential for nuclear exchange, the ultimate mutually assured destruction, it wasn't a very comfortable world. But at least we understood, where we stood in that sense. With the end of the Cold War, we then entered that period of people believing that state-on-state warfare had gone. Big peace dividends were taken, defenses were cut just about by everybody, really, and we entered a period of what we called wars of choice. And you could decide whether you wanted to engage in various conflicts around the world, be that in places like the Balkans or the Middle East or elsewhere. There were some, for us, which we had no option, Falklands campaign, Northern Ireland, but mostly we could decide whether we wanted to be involved. And we, the UK, I suppose partly because of our history and so on and our links with America, found ourselves operating in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But the argument now, of course, particularly because of Russia invading Ukraine and some of the things they got up to before that, but also because of the rise of China, and I think in particularly difficult in terms of this business of being relatively predictable, is the rise of countries like North Korea, the influence of Iran through Hezbollah and Hamas and so on, that we just live in a less predictable world. Now, there are those who argue that we're living in the 1930s. Some say as late as the mid-1930s. And by that, they mean, the potential for war with Russia in particular is like the 1930s, the run up to World War II. To be honest, I'm not in that place. But I do think we live in a much more uncertain world. And I do think we have the potential for conflict in a number of places around the world, and certainly potential for further conflict within Europe. So yeah, less predictable, certainly less certain, and we need to recognize that if we don't want that to happen, you have to deter. And in order to deter warfare, you have to have credible military capabilities, amongst other things too. So that's the pressure to say, build up military capability to be able to fight if necessary, but more hopefully, like the Cold War, not to have to fight, to deter these potential conflicts around the world.
Now, to pick up what you just said, then you need the wherewithal and other things. Really raises the question, doesn't it? I suppose you might say that there are the questions of capability. What capabilities do we have? Because we've taken that peace dividend, because armament supplies, particularly consumables, I suppose, bullets and ammunition and so forth, drones, well, all those modern things that are cheap and common now in warfare, have been run down by the West supplying Ukraine. So there's capability. Where do we stand on capability? But then there's intent, because it's a long time since we've had to defend ourselves, to stand up for our values. And I think you and I would be watching askance to some degree with a loss of confidence in our own values anyway. So how prepared do you think we are on those two fronts? Capability across the West and intent.
Yeah. John, I just want to go back one before I answer that question, which is to say the other thing that I should have said really is we have, I think, the potential. Well, there are more rogue leaders around in the world. That's what worries me, going back to that uncertainty. So whether that's one end of the spectrum, North Korea, Iran leadership, and others. I'm currently reading Max Hastings' book called The Abyss, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a great read, actually. But it's quite clear that Castro was, a rogue leader who tried to draw all sorts of things out of the Russians. But we have a lot of rogue leadership in the world. And potentially, of course, some people would argue that if Trump gets in, we've got another one coming. So that's part of that unpredictability. Now, in terms of what you put on the table there, what we're talking about here is the delivery of fighting power. And the fighting power equation is about the stuff, about the material stuff. I used to have a sign on my door in the Balkans on my first tour over there, which simply said bombs, bullets, and bits. And beans, actually, beans, bombs, bullets, and bits. So, the capabilities, the ability to sustain operations over a period of time and so on. And we have given a lot of stuff to the Ukraine, and a lot of our own stocks were in pretty poor state before that, as were a number of other countries. So there's definitely a need to rebuild the physical component of fighting power. The understanding of how to use that stuff and the willingness to use it comes under the umbrella of the conceptual component, but also the moral component, the willingness to fight, the preparedness to die on the battlefield. And that moral component, Ukraine, for example, has shown that in spades over these last couple of years, and has done a very, very impressive job. But in the West as a whole, picking up your point, I'm not convinced that many people really believe that we could find ourselves having to fight in a state-on-state type scenario. And the willingness to be able to do that is not great. And therefore, at the end of the day, you come back to leadership. You come back to leaders who are prepared to stand up and talk about this and are then prepared to put the resources into it. But it's not just about the treasure. It's about the talent and the time that you're prepared to put in what I call the 3 T's, the time, treasure, and talent equation, which is about exactly what we're talking about. It's about trying to convince people that we may have to fight here. We need to have the capability of doing that, but we need to have the willingness to do it. And why would we want to do it? Because it comes back to your other point you make, which is what are the values that we are trying to defend here? What is the sort of world we want to live in? And there are those who say we shouldn't engage with any of this. I don't agree with that, but that may be something we can come on to.
Well, that would be good. I'd like to come back to that. The reality is that all Western nations now, it's called identity politics, I suppose you'd say, have fragmented. The author David Brooks commented that he's never known in his lifetime the West to be so atomized, so divided and so distrustful. There's very little focus on national cohesion, on shared values on, if you like, commitment to your neighbour, it seems to me, in an age of identity politics, which in the end turns out to be pretty much about finding identity in self. It's all about me. You've lived a long time. You made a comment already about the idea of vocation. What's happened, do you think, culturally, that's left us rather inward looking, I think I would say, and not terribly concerned about future generations either?
Yeah, the underlying issue is, I think, a really important one. Now, one of the best writers, I believe, of our culture, our social writers, was Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi here in the UK, who I knew not well, but I'd met several times. I'd listened to him lecture. I'm looking at about half a dozen books that he wrote in my study here. And Jonathan argued that we've moved from an us and we society to a me and I society. And, without being overly simplistic about it, reflected in words like the iPod, the iPad, the selfie, and so on. And that's definitely been a shift in my lifetime. Certainly, I would argue a shift probably since the 1960s, 1970s, that sort of period. The hat badge of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst is serve to lead. The idea of servanthood, which of course is very strongly a Christian principle, summarized in Philippians, that we are here to serve one another, and to not be just focused on ourselves. Now, clearly, all of us are interested in our own lives, in ourselves, our careers, our families, and so on and so forth. But as a society, I do think there is much more division than I remember ever in my lifetime. I go to the States quite often, and I have to say, the last time I landed at Heathrow from flying back from the States, I found myself thinking, thank goodness I live in the UK. There's not a conversation in the USA anymore. It's a sort of slanging match, people insulting each other and over the issues, the obviously important issues, but nobody listens to one another. Conversation is what we're having. We talk to one another, we listen to one another, we influence each other. We are prepared to change our minds if we feel that we need to do that, and we've got things wrong. So what's been happening in the States, I think, is really worrying, and it's certainly true that it's happening here too. And I think there's something in this about our value system. I mean, I'm a Christian, as I know you are, and I would argue that the Western values come straight from the Bible. And we've gone through a shift of a generation from my time where a lot of people would have said they were Christian, B, would certainly have Bibles in their houses and would often read them and understood quite a lot of biblical principles. We've then been through a generation who have had the Bible in the house, but they've never actually got around to reading it. And now we're into a generation that very few people have a Bible in the house. And we're living on the values that were deeply rooted in, your and my generation, and I hope in my own children's generation. But as we look ahead, I do worry about what future generations will be, what they will rest on. What is their foundation? There's a great example which has been quoted, which I first read quite a long time ago, that we live in a cut flower society.
Yes, Os Guinness.
And it was referred to last year, wasn't it? And a cut flower society is a society. I've got a large garden here, and that's actually looking pretty good at the moment. Got lots of lovely flowers in it. And my wife regularly cuts flowers from the garden, puts them in a vase on the dining room table or in the kitchen, and they look fine. But I know where they're going to end up. We all know where they're going to end up in 2 or 3 weeks' time. They're going to end up in a bin because they will die. Cut flowers wither and die in a vase on a dining room table. They've been separated from their roots from which they grew. And once you've separated these things out, they don't throw fresh seeds. They don't, regrow. And I think, sadly, we're in a period of time where we are not throwing these seeds. We've separated ourselves from, some very willingly, some determinedly, to separate themselves from Judeo-Christian values. And I just think it's leading us into trouble.
The cut flower illustration, I think, came from Os Guinness. And I mention that only because you've mentioned some of the reading you're doing. He's recently written on our civilizational moment, and I do commend it because he traces through how we got to where we are, but also points the way forward, which is what often doesn't happen. There are plenty of people who can catalogue how we've lost our way, but recovering is a big issue. And as you said, we're having a conversation. That's what we need to do. These conversations are designed to do just that, to try and draw out good thinking of the sort that you're giving us at the moment, so that people can think these issues through, that we can educate ourselves. I think it's probably true to say...
Oz wrote a brilliant little book called Living in a World of Hype, Spin and Lies, about truth. And that's, I think, part of the conversation is to convince people, first of all, that there is an issue here. I mean, not everybody would agree with what we're saying, clearly. And lots of people would say, everything is fine. And there is much about today's world that is better than the world that I lived in the 1950s and 60s, in the way that people are treated. I think there are extremes in some of that. But nonetheless, if we don't convince people we have a problem, it's not about what's happening today. These changes happen incrementally over time. I think I may have said to you when we met in London, but if we were having this conversation in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon, which I happened to have visited when I was in Iraq in 2003, we would have thought that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire would last forever. The Babylonian, the Assyrian, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, civilizations in the end crash and burn, and mostly through suicide, not through murder. They collapse internally. They lose a sense of some of the things we're talking about. So my concern is not that, I'm concerned where we are today for all sorts of reasons, but my concern is where will we be in 10, 20, 50 years time? And what sort of world will we be living in then? And we can come back to that in the context of one or two other things.
Well, just to come back to some of the hard nuts and bolts of what's happening now, earlier this year, the head of the British Army, General Patrick Saunders, said, and I think I'm quoting him correctly here, Ukraine brutally illustrates that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them. The UK Army is estimated, I think at the moment, around 75,000 fully trained soldiers, which would be well down on where it was at the peak of your career. In your view, let's come back to this issue. What sort of army does Britain need? And what does it do with its navy? And what does it do about its air power?
Yeah. Well, it does go back to our earlier conversation in the context of, what do you want the balance to look like in the terms of your military capability? When we look at this whole issue of security, it's not just about military, it's about all sorts of other things too. But in the context of a pure military conversation, where's the balance between these three? Now, the army I joined was clearly, and it was 176,000, I think, when I joined. And now we're below what we were during the Napoleonic era. I mean, that's often quoted, but we shouldn't forget that we were, that era was quite an important era in terms of in Peninsular Campaign and the Napoleonic Wars and so forth. But we are very small. My own view is that mass does matter, but what that mass looks like is not just purely about numbers, although they are important. It's also about the capabilities that they bring with them. So the new Chief of the General Staff over here has just said that he wants to increase fighting power. In fact, the Chief of the Defence Staff has said the same thing. They want to increase fighting power. They want to double it by 2027 and triple it by 2030.
Wow.
Now, going back to my earlier point about fighting power, that's not just about it is about the physical component stuff, which is what we're looking at here, but it is also about thinking about how you use that stuff, the doctrine. So how do you use what's coming out of Ukraine, the cyber world, the drone world, the unmanned vehicle world, unmanned airplanes and UAVs and indeed unmanned vehicles on the land campaign and in the maritime campaign. So what does that look like? And then how do you build that moral component piece that gives people the determination? How do you build character and integrity and duty and honor and love and friendship and, quite difficult words to pin down, but are a key component of that fighting power equation. Now, coming back to the pure numbers, my own view is that we, the UK, should be capable of putting a armored division in the field capable of fighting alongside allies, because clearly we're not alone in this conversation, in other allies, European allies, NATO allies, and so on, capable of fighting alongside them and sustaining ourselves and being capable of looking after ourselves in the whole fighting power equation and the whole war fighting, high intensity war fighting. And that's what we had in the first Gulf campaign. We had 3 divisions during the Cold War based in Germany and another one back in the UK. And we are not capable of doing that now, sustaining it for any length of time. And we haven't even got the numbers to put that fighting division into Europe. Now, again, some would argue that's not necessary. In fact, the new Chief of General Staff has said, he's been upfront about saying it's not just about numbers. It is about all these other capabilities, cyber and unmanned vehicles and so on. But nonetheless, I think that that's the minimum you really can need to be able to put in the field. And in the context of where we are today, other European nations like Poland, like Germany, like France, Sweden, Finland, the other Baltic states and so on, they are spending more on defense. And there is an argument to say that they would bear the brunt of the land campaign if Russia were, and I don't think, frankly, they will, but nonetheless, if Russia were to put a foot into NATO territory. So therefore, the argument is, going back to our earlier conversation, maritime and air power is where we should be perhaps focusing most of our attention, not to the detriment of the land component. So what does that look like? Well, again, numbers are not unimportant. We now do have 2 aircraft carriers, substantial pieces of equipment. They cost us a fair bit of money. I personally am in favor of them. I know some people aren't. Max Hastings, for example, is very critical of them. But nonetheless, I think, we've got those carriers. We need to have the ability to deploy those carriers as a carrier group with a certain number of frigates and destroyers and submarines to support them and so on. And the F-35s that go on board them. And then the rest of the air component needs to be, I think, developed too. We're down to a very small number of squadrons. And crucially, I don't think we should think that the home base is any longer as secure as it was and has been for the last certainly 30 or 40 years. And we have consolidated quite a lot of our air power, for example, on single bases in the UK, which are now very vulnerable to long-range rocket missile attack, which is certainly a possibility, and very vulnerable to things like cyber attack. So I think we need to have an armored division that is capable of high-intensity warfighting, capable of deploying into Europe if necessary, and then alongside that, a stronger maritime and air component. And that's what I would like to see come out of this SDR. It will require more resources. At the end of the Cold War, we were spending around 4% of GDP on defense. The height of the Cold War, we were spending about 5 or 6%. We're now spending, well, some people would argue 2.3%, but actually it depends how you calculate the numbers, whether you include, pensions and veterans and all sorts of things in the numbers. I think we need to be spending at least 3%. Otherwise, we're not going to have the ability to make the difference that we're talking about here.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we took that peace dividend. Everybody cut their defence expenditure. I think the Europeans, by and large, have been, certainly the Western Europeans, very slow to meet their stated commitments, particularly after Ukraine emerged as a problem, to step up their defence spending. Poland and some of the Eastern Europeans have been spending a lot more. But it raises the issues not just of the political and national willpower to spend more money, but the actual ability to do it. Britain's economy, I don't want to be rude, but it's deeply in debt. Productivity is very challenged, shall I say. Growth is anemic at best. The reality is that it's going to be hard. I noticed for listeners, I just returned at the time from the UK, when the new Labor government had just been voted in, and there was a talk about the need to move to 2.5%. Seems to me that's the wrong approach. You need to work out what you think you need to do, as you've just done, and then backtrack and say, well, in the national interest, this is what we need, and we will therefore have to find the resources. And I wouldn't have thought 2.5% would do an adequate job. I'm very critical of my own country. I think we should be on 3% at least, frankly. But that's only because I have a bit of an idea of what I think should be done, and it's not being done.
Yeah, you're right. You need to start with a sheet of paper that says, what's the threat? What do we want? What place do we want to be in the world? And that's not an unimportant question. As a result of Brexit, the last government under the Conservative government talked about global Britain. And so the first question was to say, okay, what do you mean by that? And then they talked about a tilt to the Pacific and, all those other things that flowed from it. So the first question is, what do you want to be in the world? And then what capabilities do you need to deliver that? And that includes things like diplomacy and economic growth and so on. And then in terms of the military capability alongside that as well. And then once you've decided what the threat is and how you're going to counter that threat and the different ways of countering that threat, be it missile, be it aircraft, manned aircraft, unmanned aircraft, whatever, the capabilities you require, what are the options, and then where do you want to place your money? And it's naive to say that you could end up with something that says we're going to need, money that just isn't there, because you're right, the economy is in a mess. I mean, America's debt is now, I can't remember the figure, but it's well into double figures, trillions of dollars. Our national debt is now almost 100% of our GDP. And we can have a conversation about why that is the case. But the bottom line is, we are deeply in debt, and our interest on our debt is bigger than our defense budget. So you do have to say that the government are right in saying we've got to put that balance back. We've got to grow the economy, grow the size of the cake. And if we can't grow the size of the cake, then we're not going to be able to put more money into defense, because the pressures on everything else, our health service, education, etc., is not going to go away. Now, the government have said that they would like to grow to 2.5%, but they've not put a time limit to it, which, clearly I would be frustrated at, because there are some things that clearly need to happen now, as in terms of decisions, because there's a long lead time before some of these capabilities that you need to put in place will come to fruition. They don't just happen overnight. If you want new equipment, if you want to rebuild your ammunition stocks and so forth, this takes time. So the economy is a key part of this, but I think the defence review hopefully will put on the table what I've talked about, and then the government is going to have to say, well, yes, we can afford to fund that, or no, we can't, and this is where we're going to put the delta. This is what the delta is going to look like to what we can't fund, and therefore the potential implications of that.
Understood. You spoke presciently 10 years ago of we're coming back to Russia really, the strategic failure of the West to understand that Russia could not and would not stand by and watch the EU and NATO enlargement encroaching ever closer. In your view, could the current Russian-Ukrainian war have been avoided?
Well, I'm not sure it could have been avoided in one sense, but I do have some sympathy with the view that the Russians have seen this as a threat. One of my often quoted guys, inevitably, being military and British military in particular, generals will either quote Clausewitz or they'll quote Sun Tzu. One of the great Sun Tzu quotes is, if you understand yourself and you understand the enemy, you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles or 1,000 battles. Now, there are two parts to that. One is understanding ourselves. We've touched on that in a way, and I don't believe we do understand ourselves in the context of our own value systems, what we're prepared to do, and so forth. We may come back to that. In terms of understanding our enemy, we I think mistakenly believed at the end of the Cold War, and of course there are the two famous theses that were around at the time were Francis Fukuyama, the end of history.
Yeah.
The world would become free and democratic and liberal and so on and so forth. But often people forget that Huntington also wrote at that time, 92, 93, about the clash of civilizations, the potential clash of civilizations. Not that he was saying that there would necessarily be war between them, but the idea that, Western civilization, basically, the world was not going to become Western civilized and so forth in the way that we understood it, and that people didn't see democracy the way we saw it and so on. And Russia historically has been a nation that feels insecure. I mean, it's interesting reading this book, The Abyss, by Max Hastings on the Cuban crisis. What comes through very strongly is Khrushchev and the Russian perspective of this is that they need to stand tall in the world. They want to mask weakness, actually, in many respects. At the heart of that of their foreign policy is a determination to assert their greatness, the military capabilities. What they achieved in World War II is, quoted time after time in terms of Russian comment on so forth, the Great Patriotic War and what they did to bring about the defeat of Nazism, their achievements and so forth. They think they're a great power in terms of ideological view, communism clearly, but in terms of their influence around the world, and they want to be respected in the world, and they want to be seen to be a major power and a major influence. Now, we may have all sorts of comment to make about that, but that's not important. The important thing is, how do they see the world? And if we don't understand how they see the world, then we'll never begin to understand how they're going to respond to events and things that we do. Now, I'm not saying that when Eastern European countries broke away from the Soviet Union, that they shouldn't have been able to make their own choices about where they wanted to be, to join the EU, to join NATO. These are independent, sovereign countries. And, I think it's right that they've been able to make those choices. But we shouldn't have been so naive about what were the potential implications of that, and dismiss the idea that Russia would be, to put it politely, upset. I don't think necessarily it could have been avoided, but I think we could have played a better game diplomatically along the way. Yeah, that makes sense.
It is astonishing, isn't it, that they're able to sustain such terrible losses. An estimated 500,000 young Russians have died. Well, I suppose they lost countless millions during the Nazi attacks in 1941 on. But they are staggering numbers. It must be massively deleterious to the economic well-being of Russians. But it hasn't deterred them. They have a very different view of the life, the worth of the life of their individual citizens to that which we have in the West.
They do. I mean, that famous Stalin quote, which I'm never quite sure is actually a Stalin quote, but nonetheless, one death is a tragedy, a million is a mere statistic. I mean, when General Zhukov led the Russian army to take Berlin, and they lost taking Berlin more than we, the UK, lost in the whole of the war. But Zhukov's view was, if you came across a minefield, you just kept walking, because the minefield was there as a defensive position. If it wasn't a minefield, it would have been defended by Germans with machine guns and firepower and so forth. That would have caused you casualties. So you met a minefield. It wasn't covered by fire often. You just pressed on. Now, casualty figures are notoriously difficult to really pin down, but nonetheless, it is absolutely true, undoubtedly, that they have lost huge numbers of people. But they don't see that in the same way that we do. It's about understanding who they are and how they see the world and how they see the way they fight. So I'm not surprised in that sense that their view, what I think we're into Ukraine at the moment is a sort of 1916 period, where large numbers of people are becoming casualties for relatively small gains of terrain. In 1916, Battle of the Somme and so forth, tiny gains in terms of territory, but huge losses. And that's where we are in the Ukraine at the moment. But the Russians, they're not going to go away on this. They will persist. Now, long term, the Russians have a demographic problem, like many of us. But for the moment, they're getting support from North Korea. They're getting support from China. North Korea supposedly putting people there as well as equipment. So that pressure is not going to go away. And I don't think that the Russian generals are going to stop, fighting the way they fight. I mean, they clearly are using other systems too, but nonetheless, ultimately, they are prepared to take those sorts of casualties. And we have to recognize the reality of that.
It's hard to see how a peace might be brokered. Interestingly, Trump claims that he'll cauterize it and fix it very quickly. Heaven only knows what that means, but it's certainly the case that his new vice running mate, J.D. Vance, is making it very plain that in sync with what a lot of the right in America now seems to think, America should withdraw and focus on the Middle East, the Pacific in particular, and get out of the Ukraine. It's hard to know what that might look like. So there's a double-barreled sort of thing I'd be interested in your views on. Any thoughts on what a settlement might look like? And you made the interesting comment that you didn't think that Russia would be a challenge again afterwards. How does that fit with what you've also said about them being a culture that is very sensitive to their own standing and their own pride, and presumably a
Yeah.
desire to rebuild Russia.
Yeah. I mean, Putin has made it quite clear that he believes the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is the breakup of the Soviet Union, not not World War II, not the losses incurred in World War II. It's the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he is very driven by this whole prestige stuff that I've referred to. Um, the reason I say that they have really struggled clearly in Ukraine, and there is clearly the potential, particularly in the Baltics, where they've got the corridor and into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, but large Russian-speaking populations and so on. So there's definitely a threat there. I'm not saying there's not a threat, and there's not a possibility that they would try to do something there. I don't think it's a probability, and I don't think he's going to want to take on NATO, which what that would entail. I do think there's other things he's going to get up to, and I think he's already doing it in places like the Balkans, where Serbia is a key, friend of Russia, and I think they're encouraging Serbia to stir up trouble in the Balkans again. So their ability to stir up trouble, engage in these other things, I think is definitely there. All I'm saying, I think, is I just don't see what the threat was during the Cold War, that divisions of Russian armor are going to come trundling into NATO territory. I just don't think he's stupid enough to do it. Now, I've talked about rogue leadership, rogue leaders like, North Korea, Iran, and so forth, and clearly Putin is in that category. And notwithstanding what I've said earlier, I don't claim to understand Putin. I mean, he may do all sorts of things. And one of the conversations that is important is whether he would be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons, for example, either to secure, to hold on to Crimea, or indeed to try and regain more territory in the Ukraine. And there is a possibility of that. I don't think it's a probability, but it is a possibility. Now, in terms of the end of the war, I just think it's inevitable, really, that it will be a negotiated settlement. The key, Trump will not settle this in a day. I mean, at the end of, that's not going to happen. But Zelensky is under a lot of pressure internally. There is, I think, a reality linked to some of the conversation we've had already of Ukraine's ability to retake the lost territory. The declared intent, and some Western people still agree with this, that they should regain all their lost territory, including some people say Crimea. Well, frankly, unless we are prepared to give them an awful lot of more equipment, and in particular, train their operational level commanders, allow them to use things like ATACMS and the other Storm Shadow and so forth to strike deep into Russia, I just don't think they're going to have the ability to conduct the counteroffensives required to retake all that territory. So the danger is this thing is going to drag on for quite a long time. The pressure from America with a change of leadership, I think will change. I don't think they will pull plugs completely, but nonetheless, their concern quite a while now has been the Pacific, as you say. It's a China focused, Pacific focused concern, and they haven't got the ability to fight two major campaigns in Europe and the Pacific at the same time. I mean, they would struggle to do that anyway. So I think it'll have to be a negotiated settlement. The question is when. And Zelensky is not about, I don't think Zelensky is about to give up on regaining at least some of this territory. But there are internal pressures. And I think if the Americans and others were to start putting more pressure on him to get round the negotiating table, and there's been talk of that, there's been some talk of them beginning to have conversations. My own gut instinct is it will end up with some lost territory for Ukraine. And my concern is, I don't want that, but that's where I think it'll end up. And my concern is, do you end up in a situation like Korea, where there's a line drawn, but it's not actually a peace agreement per se, and you end up by thinking, okay, so what's Russia going to do in 2, 3, 5, 10 years? And what would stop that happening? Things like Ukraine joining NATO and so on, which I just think is a bit of a red line for Russia. The whole history of Russian orthodoxy, the spiritual homeland in Kiev, and all of the history of Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that we know that Ukraine has not been under the Russian thrall for more than, or it's been under the Russian thrall for less than half of its lifetime, in inverted commas. But the Russian perspective is that Ukraine, like Belarus, is a key part of Russia. So I don't see that this is going to go away quickly. It's pretty despondent, really. But But I think the fighting will go on for a while. There is a stalemate. I can't really see the Ukrainians breaking through. It's possible the Russians would break through in an offensive later on this year or next. But I think it's going to end up in some sort of negotiated settlement.
Picking up on your point about the need to actually understand, and that implies the need to know your history, I suspect, and we're not very good at history anymore, but to know how your adversaries and your friends think, as well as how you think yourself, and to switch focus a little while we pursue that theme. You were involved in the planning of the 2003 Allied invasion of Iraq. It was swift and successful. And I was, of course, in office in Australia. We were part of that. But the post-invasion period of nation building was not swift and successful in terms of outcomes. And you've had quite a bit to say about that. What can we apply in terms of lessons learnt from the failures in Iraq to what's happening now, both in the Middle East, frankly, as well as in Ukraine?
Yeah, I was involved in the planning, but I also was involved in the post-war planning. In that I went in early 2003. I went to Washington, worked with Jay Garner, who'd set up an office of post-war planning, and then went to Kuwait and then into Baghdad as part of that post-war phase 4 operations, as we would call it. And I watched strategic failure unfurl, and it was not a pleasant experience. I now lecture on failure as a result of it. And I came back from that deployment pretty drained, physically exhausted, frankly, because it had gone on for months, but also emotionally and spiritually exhausted too, because it was really difficult to see this thing collapse. But I think, you know, it was different than Ukraine, or indeed potentially for the Middle East. I think they are two different things. In Iraq, Ghana tried to get the Iraqi people and the Iraqi politicians in particular to come together to form some sort of government pretty quickly to take on responsibility for building Iraq back up post-war. Bremer's arrival changed the equation completely. And there were 3 big decisions that Bremer came with. I think he came with them in his pocket, probably Cheney driven, but I don't know that for sure. But they were to demobilize the Iraqi army, which Jay was trying to use, to clear the place up, I mean, literally, but also to think about how he could use some of them in terms of security. So they demobilized the Iraqi army. And when I say demobilize, I don't just mean, you know, we don't want you anymore. They didn't pay them. They didn't give them any pensions. So these guys had no option but to pick up a Kalashnikov and ring up their mates and say, we're going to have to fight. You know, we're going to have to find a way of making a living here, because they and their families otherwise would have starved. Secondly, they decapitated the Ba'athist party officials, and the only conversation was how deep do we go into these organizations, particularly the ministries and the organizations that were running the power, the health systems, and so on. Now, most of the numbers of 1 and 2 in Iraq had gone by the time the military operation was over. But we were dealing with, in Baghdad, and I was involved in some aspects of this, alongside obviously many others, dealing with the numbers 3 and 4 in these industries and ministries. And we were talking with them, they were beginning to work with us, and so on. Bremer decapitated down to at least level 4 and took away all of the, the understanding of how these systems worked, on the basis that these were bad people. Well, you didn't get to senior positions in Iraq unless you were a Ba'athist. I mean, that's a simple truth of it. But that was a big mistake. And I have to tell you, I was in a room with a US general who I got to know really well. And he was in tears over this. I mean, he said, this is a disaster. You know, he was the guy trying to get the power running, get the whole power distribution, water systems up and running, the infrastructure up and running, and so on. And the third thing that Bremer did was to completely slow down the whole political process. He became effectively the viceroy of Iraq. And all the aspirations that Ghana had set in place were just swept away overnight. So, I could bang on about a bit more than that, but those 3 big decisions were very, very, in my view, very poor decisions, which resulted in the chaos that followed, the counterinsurgency campaign and so on. In Ukraine, it'll be very different. We've got to allow the Ukrainians to lead on this, recognizing that there are problems. I mean, there are still serious problems of corruption and so on. But, we are friendly forces to them. They are to us. They're going to have to lead. They're going to need the time, the treasure, and the talent to enable them to rebuild. And actually, I attended a conference in London last year with the then Ukrainian ambassador in the UK about they were beginning to think through how we're going to rebuild Ukraine using private sector support, banks, Western banks, and so on and so forth to fund it. So people are beginning to think this through, and I think there will be, a reasonable plan put in place. These plans never survive first contact, of course, but it will be very different to what happened in Iraq. The Middle East, I think, is different. Rebuilding Gaza, I think, has to be largely Arab-led from people in the Middle East, funded by people like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, others. They will not want Western powers involved, I don't think, in rebuilding Gaza. So again, it's a different situation.
It's also different, as you and I discussed in London, in the sense that it's hard for us, I suppose, as materialist beings now in the West, having deserted our own Christian roots, very hard for us to understand the role of fervent religious belief and how it plays out in the Middle East, it seems to be. And you had some observations to make about that. How people in the Middle East see democracy versus theocracy, if I can put it that way. And also the division that we don't seem to be talking about much at the moment, the Shiites and Sunnis, which I think is probably relevant as well in terms of who's supporting Gazans and who's not, because one of the things that a lot of the Western media is not focusing on is that a lot of Arabic countries are not very sympathetic, it seems to me, to Gaza. And that seems to me to be that Sunni Shiite split again.
Yeah, no, you're
very broad, I
right.
know, but I'd be interested in your views on this. You understand the Middle East when most of us don't.
Well, I wouldn't claim to be an expert, to be honest, but I know it goes back to the Battle of Karbala and the division of the, who's going to follow on from Muhammad to take on the leadership and so on. So this split has been around for a long time. Battle of Karbala was, I think, 7th century BC or something.
And this is the Shiite-Sunni split.
Sorry, not BC, 7th century AD. Yeah, the division between the Sunni and Shia. So Iran is obviously supporting both emotionally, if you like, but also with money and resources and training and so on. People like Hamas, people like Hezbollah, and a lot of terrorism around the world. On the other side of the coin is Saudi Arabia and countries like Bahrain and UAE and so on. And they are definitely not pro-Hamas. It's why, notwithstanding what's been going on in Gaza and the way that Israel has taken this campaign and delivered its campaign, obviously to the detriment of world opinion, but actually from a military point of view, I think there's a different conversation to be had there in terms of the casualties and so forth. The way they've conducted it has been, pretty impressive in many ways, but there has been the downside of the way the world opinion has followed this. But Saudi and these other countries are definitely not pro-Hamas, and they are definitely, in a way, delighted, maybe too strong a word, but actually may not be too strong a word, delighted that Israel is taking Hamas out and is trying to create a different situation. We shouldn't forget that something like 70% of the people of Gaza voted for Hamas, and Hamas' declared intent is that Israel will be wiped off the map. So, Israel's got, in my view, has got no option but to do what it's doing. And its relationship with the Saudis and indeed other Arab nations prior to October, the October event, was actually getting, relatively stable. They were beginning to build relationships. People acknowledged this has been going on, obviously, since 1947, or the 48 war, the 56, the 67 war, the 73 war. I think everybody in the Middle East has said, we've got to a point here. We've got to accept that Israel is here. We're going to have to deal with it, work with it, and we need to move on. And Hamas, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, I know there's no doubt in my mind, that October the 17th was a deliberate act in order to try to get Israel to respond in the way that it's responded, in order to try and drive a wedge back between the Arab world as a whole and between Israel. I think they've failed in that. I mean, Israel, I think, walked into a trap in all sorts of ways, which we could discuss, but I think Hamas has failed in its intent to bring back that wider division between the Arab world and Israel. And I don't think there's any doubt that the rest of the Arabs want this thing to settle down and they want to move on. The question, I think, one of the questions is, okay, what does that mean for Hezbollah and northern Israel? But this distinction between Sunni and Shia is, a really powerful driver in the Middle East. And it's one of the things that I think we collectively, the West, and I have to say particularly the Americans, did not get right, did not fully understand, actually, in Iraq, when we went into Iraq. And I remember a conversation in the Foreign Office where, and I'm not exaggerating, a senior Foreign Office official, a British Foreign Office official, said, religion's got nothing to do with this. He was an atheist. He wasn't interested in religion at all. He believed that the UK would become an atheist nation pretty quickly. That Christianity was gone, and I couldn't believe some of the things he was saying. This lack of understanding about the Arab world and this huge division between Sunnis and Shia, and it has had and will continue to have an important impact in the Middle East and indeed elsewhere in the world.
It's impossible for me. I really can't understand how anybody could be as that person you've just described was. I mean, how do you account for the fact that Hamas has written into its Articles of Association that Israel should be obliterated? They regard
absolutely.
Jews as subhuman. The attack they launched on October the 7th was an unbelievable and extraordinary assault on everything you might regard as representing civilization and decent values and standards. It was absolutely brutal and cruel beyond belief, and they boasted of it. Not even the Nazis boasted when they about the gas chambers. They didn't want it known in their own country, let alone in the world. But these people boasted, and yet Hamas is winning the global propaganda war.
It is, and it underlying that is a broader issue. I read recently that anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. It is easily awoken. And it is extraordinary, I think, that how the response around the world has been so anti-Semitic over what's going on in Israel, in the way they've responded. Now, there can be a conversation about the use of air power and the use of the way they've conducted their military campaign. But there's lots of evidence, if you compare it to previous campaigns and wars like fighting in built-up areas is always one of the most difficult aspects of warfare, that casualties that are caused and so forth. There's lots of evidence we could use and others are using to show that Israel has actually fought this campaign pretty well. Of course, people have been hurt in huge numbers, and nobody would have wanted that. But ultimately, that's not Israel's fault, that's Hamas's fault. And I despair, actually, at the way the Western media quotes and uses Hamas figures and comments a lot, and seemingly has had, I don't think, a particularly neutral or impartial way of reporting on some of this stuff. But anti-Semitic, underlying this is a strong anti-Semitic view of a lot of people, and it's been extraordinary the number of demonstrations we've had that have been so anti-Israel over what's been going on, and a complete ignorance of what Hamas has, exactly as you just said, what Hamas have done. I mean, people parading on the streets supporting Hamas, but frankly, Hamas would throw them off the top of the buildings in terms of their sexuality, or in terms of their political views, or whatever. It is unbelievable.
And it all is justified with this unbelievably simplistic and utterly inadequate idea that somehow the world can be divided into two classes, and it defines good and evil, and those two classes are colonists and those who are colonizers, and those who are colonized. And I think that's incredibly simplistic. But it's also very dangerous. A former Prime Minister of Australia from the other side of politics to me, Bob Hawke, commented that when the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. And as you say, anti-Semitism is a light sleeper, and whenever it's awakened, it seems to me that you can assume that great evils will follow. The 1930s and 40s being the obvious, but by no means only example. And I can't help wondering whether, I'd be interested in your views on this, whether Israel is actually not quite vulnerable at the moment. And
well, it is certainly vulnerable. Yeah, it is certainly vulnerable um, to Iran. And, as we know, I mean, the Houthis have just launched a drone attack on Israel only in the last few days. And I didn't mention them earlier as being under the influence, under the Iranian influence. So it is one of the things that's changed, obviously, in the last few years is the ability to strike deep into people's territory from a long way away. Clearly, we had strategic bombing in World War II, but we've now got the ability with weapon systems that means people like small terrorist groups in places like Yemen can actually hit countries like Israel and attack their major cities. And clearly, obviously, Russia have been doing that in Ukraine for the last couple of years. So they are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to that sort of long range attack, but they're also vulnerable to what Hamas has been trying to do. I think Israel will survive all of this personally. I think the Arab world, as I said earlier, recognizing Israel, they're not going to wipe Israel off the face of the map, and neither should they. And therefore, there's going to have to be some sort of understanding that will continue. But yeah, they are vulnerable, and I've got no doubt at all that whilst I don't want to be in any sense anti-Arab, I think we the West need to somehow strike the balance, but certainly supporting the reality that Israel is a democracy, that it has a right to exist, and that we should ensure that we give it the capabilities to enable that.
The prospect of Iran actually managing to build nuclear weapons is a truly chilling one, and yet it looks closer than ever. And I'd have to say, I think the Biden administration was very ineffective on that front. And now it looks as though, I understand, Russia may be helping Iran accelerate that program. We could find ourselves in quite short order confronting the reality that Iran, like North Korea, has nuclear military capability.
We could. I think it's inevitable, actually. And it goes back to my earlier comment that we live in a more unpredictable and unstable world. And my concern that those who are becoming nuclear powers, their leadership is not the equivalent of the Cold War leadership that we were discussing earlier. During that period of the Cold War, people essentially understood nuclear deterrence. Academically, politically, and in the military, it was much debated. And the whole business about escalation and tripwire and mutually assured destruction, et cetera, was a very key part of that whole Cold War period. And ultimately, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis that I referred to earlier, Khrushchev recognized that he could not, he couldn't do anything other than pull these nuclear weapons out of Cuba because he couldn't risk the idea of a global nuclear war. Or even though people like Castro, as I said earlier, were trying to encourage him to use the nuclear weapons that were already in Cuba at the time. And we've got a whole leadership developing around the world that doesn't understand deterrence theory in the way that we did before. And indeed, within Western politicians, I don't think they do either. So Iran getting a nuclear weapon alongside others, I think the trouble is if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then Saudi Arabia and the others will want one too, because of that Sunni-Shia divide we were touching on. Pakistan has been involved in helping with the technology, as you say. Russia, I think, has been. So we are going to end up in a world where leaders, like unstable leaders, like North Korea, like Iran, like others, are going to end up with nuclear weapons. And that's not just strategic nuclear weapons. Like Korea, obviously, North Korea wants to be able to show that it can hit the eastern seaboard of America. This will also be about tactical nuclear weapons. And I think I've often said in my lifetime that there would be a dirty bomb go off in a major city in the West. And I think that's still clearly a possibility. I think the chances of your use of a tactical nuclear weapon in a conflict like the Middle East and elsewhere, is certainly a possibility. And I think increasingly it will become a probability. And we need to understand what that looks like, what it means, and how we collectively act to provide the deterrence to ensure that risk is minimized. I don't think it will go away, but I think we can minimize it.
There are many in the face of all of this, including on the right in America, who would say, let's leave the rest of the world to their problems and we'll just look inward. Probably easier for the Americans. They're such a big economy with so many resources, they could live on their own for a while. But for Australians, for example, to say, well, we'll stay out if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, I think that's very naive. We'll be flattened in economic terms and possibly other ways as well, even if we did choose to remain neutral. But anyway, I'm preempting what I wanted, which was your view. What would you say to those who say, look, we just should stay out of these conflicts in the West, just withdraw unto ourselves, be friends unto ourselves to the extent that we can be, and let the rest of the world flog all this stuff out?
Yeah, and there is a strong undercurrent of that, I think, not just in America but elsewhere. Actually, funny enough, a very good friend of mine's son lives in Australia, and doesn't work academically with one of the universities. And they'd done some research not that long ago, 5 years ago, in which quite an extraordinary percentage of the students at the university said that they would be prepared to live under a sort of Chinese-style democracy.
Whatever that
and I
is.
thought, crikey, well, it was, unbelievable. Now, one's got to be careful about some of these polls and researches and so forth. But nonetheless, there is an underlying generational view that, we in the West, and to be fair, there's some truth and evidence to support it, in these wars of choice I referred to earlier, we've not done particularly well in it. Iraq, Afghanistan, places, in Africa, elsewhere in Africa, we haven't done particularly well in this. And therefore, unless it's a matter of a war of national survival, why should we get involved? Now, I think it takes us back to it's not just an intellectual conversation. I think it's a really important conversation that matters. The Fukuyama view of the world clearly hasn't emerged. And Huntington, for all of its, it was not an easy essay in some respects to read through, but his basic premise was that this was a war, that the conflict would be between cultures as opposed to, individual sovereign states, and that there are lots of different cultures, and the high end of culture is civilization, and that there are different sorts of civilization. Western civilization is one, but there are many others. And I think we need to think about what that means for us, and what sort of world do we want to live in, and what sort of world do we think the majority of people want to live in. And we've seen after the Cold War that cultural civilization thing playing out in things like the breakup of Yugoslavia, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Indo-Pakistan wars that were going on in the 60s and elsewhere. The universality of Western values and political systems, the idea that is, a one-size-fits-all, certainly Huntington argued, is naive, and attempts to democratize the world will only fail. But these civilizations matter. So I'm not one. It's rather like a debate about Christianity. The world is going, losing its Christian focus and so forth. One option for us as Christians is to pull up the drawbridge and say, well, you live the life you want to live, and just wait to see what the consequences will bring. I don't think that's the answer. I think we have to engage with these things. I think we have to engage with what's going on in places like China and elsewhere. You don't go to war necessarily, certainly lightly in those circumstances, but you have to continue to influence. And at the end of the day, this is a battle of ideas. It's a battle of values. It's about, it's not just about military power. It's about, what is important in the way that we live our lives. And the heartbeat of freedom, I think, burns within a family in Myanmar in the same way that it does in the UK and Australia or elsewhere. They may not want democracy as we understand it, and there is undoubtedly evidence to show that some countries seem to be more capable and comfortable with, communism, oblique, not dictatorships, but that sort of end of the spectrum. And Singapore, I suppose you could argue, is a good example of that. But nonetheless, I don't think we can just pull up the drawbridge and say to the rest of the world, you get on with it and to hell with the consequences. Because in the end, the flood waters rise and they come to you. You can't just stand like Canute on the side of the seashore and hold back the flood tide. Well, if we don't win the battle of values and ideas, we will end up by losing our own values.
Well, on that, just as World War II was a very different war to the Second World War, and then I suppose the First Gulf War was different to the Second World War, the reality is that many people would say now that we're in a sort of grey war already
Yeah.
with massive interference flowing out. We know from Russia attempting to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, and it's obvious that the Chinese are extraordinarily ruthless and deeply engaged in trying to interfere with the politics, with the running, with the businesses, with the cultural values even of other countries. I mean, there's no getting away from that. So as you say, the water's seeping in everywhere, and we might not want to talk about being involved with others, but they want to be involved with us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Because this isn't a one-sided conversation. This is about a worldview, going back to understanding your adversaries, understanding your enemy. There is a worldview that they have about how, and they definitely believe, I don't think there's any doubt about this in my mind anyway, that China and Russia and others think that the West is crumbling.
Yeah.
It's crumbling at the edges. It's internally, it's crumbling, our value systems and so on. I mean, we've touched on that, but there's a deeper debate that can be had about why that is so and what it looks like. But I genuinely think that they believe we are crumbling, and that therefore their view of the world will win through in the end. That we are the ones who are going to, disappear. That our civilization will be the one that follows on from the Babylonian, Persian, Assyrian, Greek, Roman, etc., etc. I mean, the British Empire, has gone. And actually, it's one of the few empires that was given up very differently to collapsing internally and being defeated from outside. But although there's an element of both of those things, but they would think that they're going to win through on this. And
they may be right, Tim.
Who say they're wrong? Yeah,
they may well be right. That's what chills me.
They may well be right. And how that battle is going to be fought? The grey zone that you touch on is absolutely a reality today. And it's a reality in many different ways. Clearly, the most obvious one is cyber. That's not necessary. It's not only cyber attack from abroad. It can also emerge from Microsoft software, hitting the cloud. But as it's just done. But no, I think we have got to win the battle of ideas. We've got to influence the thinking, and you can do that through lots of different ways today in terms of communication, social media, and lots of different ways of media communications. The whole cyber world. And so forth, that relates to that. And I am not despondent about this, but I do think it comes back to something I touched on earlier. Ultimately, this is about morally courageous leadership. And I think the West has suffered from a lack of morally courageous leadership, not collectively, completely, but overall, that's the issue that I think we need to see that the growth and development of. We need to encourage our leadership. We need to win. We need to convince our leadership that this is a battle that is happening. It's real, and it's one that we can win through on. But it is going to take time, talent, and treasure in order to deliver, what we would see as success ultimately.
Well, John Hart once said to me that one of the greatest sports in life is reinforcing one another's prejudices. And that's, I thought of that then because I absolutely agree with you. You've been very generous with your time. Can I just ask you to take you back to the beginning? You made the comment, and I ask this in the context of, do we believe in ourselves? And in this country, and I notice commentary to the same effect in Britain, it's very hard to recruit and retain the good people you want in your military. And you said you can't imagine why people wouldn't want to do it. Elaborate. There'll be younger people. There will be. We know that from our research, and we're very sympathetic. And I'm very, very keen to encourage tomorrow's leaders. Some of them will be listening to this. Why should they think of the military? It's not just. I mean, it can be dangerous. It can be risky. People say, "Oh, you don't want to put yourself in that role." But you said it can be great fun, very rewarding, and presumably, both of us would argue very strongly, very important as well. It can be important and noble.
Yeah, and I think noble is a good word. I mean, there are lots of words that were around when I was a young cadet in 1964 that we don't hear much about anymore. And I include amongst that honour, and integrity and fidelity and love and friendship. That's probably more used around the world, but nonetheless, I did 43 years. I say man and boy. 64 to 73. I left in February 2017. No, 2030. Can't even remember the day I left. But it was 43 years, man and boy, 2017, from 64. And I loved every day of it. I mean, that may sound a bit over the top, but it's true. I loved every day of it. I loved being with the people, the whole aspect of the challenges, the variety, being outdoors, being engaged in the world, making a difference. I look back on my various commands at squadron level, at battalion, brigade, and divisional level. And my brigade, as a brigade commander deployed in Kosovo, building and running refugee camps, saving the lives of an awful lot of people, helping in Northern Ireland to defeat terrorism, helping in the Balkans to push back against ethnic cleansing and the brutality that was going on there. These are very rewarding places to have been. I think encouraging young people that they matter individually, that they can make a difference, that as being part of a powerful team of like-minded people, led well, served, as I said earlier, the hat badge of serve to lead, the opportunities that are available to them. So I clearly I am what I am. I'm 73 and I lived through all of that. And the world is a different place, and youngsters see the world differently. There are a lot more opportunities today than there were back in the 60s. They can go and do other things, but I think they need to be inspired that the sort of conversation we've been having matters, and that they can play a part in that. And part of the problem, I have to say too, is making sure that when you've got these youngsters, when they're interested, you recruit them quickly, and you welcome them, and you give them the opportunities that they need, and you work hard to retain them. One of our problems in the UK at the moment is our retention rates are not good. That's partly because of poor accommodation. It's partly for all sorts of reasons we could talk about. But so retaining soldiers as well as recruiting them in the first place, and making sure, and I'm not embarrassed to say this, making sure that they know they are loved as individual, unique, magical, individual human beings who matter. We care about them, and we want them to be in a place and have the abilities and have the leadership that takes them to the sort of places I've served, and that they can look back with a great deal of pleasure and pride at what they've been able to achieve. And there's not many careers that I would that can do that. There are others, of course there are, in all sorts of different ways, but it's a pretty good place to be, I think.
Thank you so very much. It's been terrific having the opportunity to tease these issues out a bit.
Thank you, John. I've enjoyed it very much.